I actually don't need to be talking. It's just a technical thing. I'm filling space. The last one I wanted to mention to you is a change in date for our last Philosophers Café here in Edmonton. It was titled "Are Deep Attachments to Other Human Beings a Necessary Part of Living Excellently?" And it was scheduled for Saturday the 26th of March. We have moved that to the 2nd of April. So if you'll take note of that, it'll be listed on our website, and we'll announce it the next time we gather as well. So, thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Steve Martin, who's an associate professor of theology at the King's University College. As all of you, I trust, are aware, theology is the queen of the sciences, and since most public universities have become republic in nature, they beheaded her. But at some schools, she remains. Steve did his doctoral work in South Africa and was involved in doing research for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He also has written what I think is a remarkable book on the way in which the faith traditions out of the terror of history in South Africa, how they have navigated their self-understanding, both those who had a deeply racist perspective as well as others. He's also the co-editor of a book titled "Facing the Truth: South African Faith Communities and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission." So I'm delighted you're here and look forward to you opening this up for us.
So much feedback.
I know we're supposed to get feedback, but and there is a nice buzz in the room, but maybe that's not such a nice
Actually,
buzz.
if you pull the microphone back behind the speakers, you'll probably cut down some of the buzz.
Okay. Back off, in other words.
It actually started with the Ruthie extension cord.
Yeah, it might be, the extension cord is actually quite close to the speaker cord, so maybe if you move this away from the extension.
Can I just do a test?
Wasn't sure.
Why don't we all sing something? Anybody have a favorite song? Okay, I can keep speaking. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Good. Excellent. Now, it's a little intimidating when I look at some of the other people who have spoken at this gathering and some of the topics that have been dealt with. I am not a moral philosopher, and this very much seems like the territory that should belong to moral philosophers. So I do appreciate you gathering to hear someone who is a theologian, and you know, if you want to try this out afterwards, I'm open to being a guinea pig. If you prick me, I will indeed lead. Now, I understand that the convention here is to give some introductory remarks before animating the discussion. I'm actually more inclined to ask some questions and make some comments about the question that is before us. Is a religious, in brackets, theistic worldview a help or a hindrance in living an excellent life? So after I make... A little closer? Okay. I may have to hold the... What if I moved it this way? This is fine? Okay. My field of vision is... Okay, right. Okay. All right.
Excellent.
At the end, I hope that I will make a provocative enough statement to get us going. So, can we even talk about an excellent life across different worldviews? That's an initial question that I had when I looked at the topic for today. It's an important question, I think, especially in a society that considers itself to be pluralistic, but also finds itself in a world where different worldviews lead to so much violence. So I hope, for the sake of a human future, that the answer about discoursing about notions of excellence across worldviews is an affirmative one. But I hope the answer is yes for another reason. Because I don't hear this question articulated in our culture, especially as our culture is characterized by practices of getting and practices of spending. And these things seem to occupy most, if not all, of our time. And I fear that regardless of the worldview differences that we may want to talk about, we all imagine life as part of that great shopping mall called modernity. That is to say, that we all inhabit actually the same worldview, but there are gradations within it. Think of the food court in a shopping mall, where you can ask for Chinese, Italian, Japanese, Thai, or good old-fashioned North American food. Regrettably, all of the distinctive flavor has been sucked out of it. So I hope that we can talk about discussing notions of excellence, which allows us to occupy the actual positions and worldviews that we hold, without sort of trying to find some kind of a common denominator of discourse. So I hope that that is possible. It's also a question, I think, that needs to be asked on a university campus. Is this actually on the U of A campus?
No.
No? Okay. Okay. Well, it's also a question that needs to be asked near a university campus by university people. 15 or so years ago, Bill Reddings of the Université de Montréal published a very interesting book called The University in Ruins. In this book, he talks about the career of the modern university, especially the modern research university. And he talks about the way that, I suppose about 30 or 40 years ago, universities discovered themselves to be in competition with each other. So their response to this competitive, pluralistic atmosphere was to formulate mission statements. You've all seen the mission statement of a university, okay? And these mission statements articulated what was unique about this university, whether it's the University of Alberta, the University of Aberdeen, the University of Montana, the University of Montreal. They all articulated what made this university to be different from all of the other universities. But Reddings found, the problem is that they all said the same thing. That this university is unique in its commitment to excellence, right? The word excellence was common. Unfortunately, Reddings also discovered that none of the universities actually bothered to define what this word excellence meant. So it was effectively, for Reddings, an empty signifier. It actually meant nothing. So it's important that we have this kind of a discussion that freely uses this word excellence in a way that actually invites us to give it content. Okay, what do you mean by excellence? Not just verbal content, but also practical content as well. Now, another question or comment concerns this notion of religious worldview. Religious worldview. Now, I have to confess a certain ambivalence about this word religious, or in its noun form, religion. Because it's come to designate in modernity one of two things. Firstly, institutions which reflect a bygone era, that is an era before we were enlightened by scientific reason, These institutions are, of course, declining in interest and influence. Actually, that's not true if you go to the part of the world that I spend a fair amount of time in, Southern Africa. Or religion refers to idiosyncratic beliefs held in private by people who cannot face the cold realism of a post-Enlightenment world. So religion is either quaint or weird, or perhaps a bit of both. It certainly is not particularly modern. So when we talk about a religious worldview, in a sense, those who would want to claim to be speaking for or speaking out of a religious perspective are already at a disadvantage. But there's another view of religion, another way of talking about religion, and it actually reflects the etymology of the word religio, which is from the Latin religere, which means to bind together. In this sense, religion is that which binds a people to each other, that which gives a people, either collectively or members of a collective, a sense of identity or purpose in the world. Religion in this view also speaks of something to which a people give themselves or offer themselves. Taken in this sense, religion is not the property of a particular group, but a dimension of all human life, whether excellent or not. Okay, so it's not like there are religious people and non-religious people, but in a sense, all human beings are religious in some way. So if we understand it in this sense, modernity hasn't replaced what traditionally has been referred to as religion, but simply displaced it onto things like the nation, the folk, the mall, the sports team. I'll have more to say about this in a minute. Now, extending this definition of religion in maybe a more theological direction, religion has to be connected with another term, and that term is worship. In Greek, the term that's translated in English, worship, actually means something you do with your body. It's something that you bend yourself towards or you bow yourself before. So it's actually not something that's conceptual. It's something that you do with your body. In English, our term worship is a contraction of two words, worth and ship. So when we talk about worship, we're talking about the act of ascribing worth to something. And of course, if we're talking in religious terms, the act of ascribing worth to something that is considered of highest value. So again, religion is not something that belongs to people who engage in quaint rituals or hold idiosyncratic beliefs. It's something that we see everywhere. But you'll say, wait a minute. The question, after all, does state that religious worldview means theistic worldview. Now, I have to confess that I also feel ambivalent about this word theism, because not all that goes by the name religion is theistic in the sense of believing in a deity that transcends space and time, who is the creator and governor of all things. Buddhism is an example of what we would call, in the popular sense, religion, but not necessarily holding to a theistic religion. But also, if we use religion in the second sense that I've suggested already, as an activity that binds, the human sense of belonging to something greater than themselves is also religious, and those, or that thing to which humans confess themselves to belong, is their God. Whether that God is the nation, the people, a particular brand, something that they would kill for, die for, whatever. So gods are as ubiquitous as religion. So when we talk about a religious or a theistic worldview, I want us to be open to the possibility that there might be some slippage about what is included in that category and what is excluded. Now, the idea of worldview, this is an excellent idea. I have spent most of my professional life preaching to students the importance of having an integrated worldview. That is a worldview that brings life, faith, and scholarship together. Part of my career is on is talking about how that is important. Worldviews are visions of the world. They function like a set of spectacles. Sorry. Spectacles that frame and focus our experience. They make sense of the world for us, allowing us to act with integrity in the world. Now some people, in talking about worldviews, have shifted the metaphor slightly, making the connection with narratives or stories. Worldviews are communicated in stories. We might even say that worldviews are scripts that give us the cues for meaningful action in the world. But of course, worldviews also talk about how the world is not all it could be. So they don't always talk about, they don't always describe the world, they also prescribe a better world. They talk about why the world is not all that it can be, and some worldviews will say that the world is not all it can be because there are too many religious people running around, believing in gods and killing people over debates about gods. You know, that's also a description and a prescription. So how do we make the world better? I was actually listening to a debate this morning involving Christopher Hitchens, and he thinks that we can make the world better by getting rid of religion. The world would be much better if we could get rid of religion. So they guide our action individually and collectively towards a better, more excellent world. But worldviews are also particular, with apologies to another person I was listening to this morning, Sam Harris, and those who think that science can determine a universal system of values. His latest book, which I've not read, professes to find ways that science can help determine human values, which is really Orwellian when you think about it, at least given the scientists that I know. If you're a scientist here, that's fine. You know, God bless you. There's no such thing as a universal worldview. Worldviews are social constructs that develop out of particular communities' negotiations with their environment, which of course includes other communities. Okay, so no universal worldview, but worldviews are, in a sense, universal in that everybody has one or lives out of one. But even given that this acknowledgement of the ubiquity of worldviews or scripts or narratives or myths or whatever you want to call it, there's another question which is raised for me, and that is any worldview, whether we're talking about Christianity or scientific materialism or get it and spend it consumerism or some combination of these, is any worldview sufficient to produce virtuous, which is the old-fashioned word for excellent, I think. Is any worldview sufficient to produce virtuous behavior? Worldview language, after all, talks about perspective, about ways of seeing. But when we talk about virtue, we're not talking about perspective, we're talking about behavior. We're talking about action. We're talking about what people do. So how do we make the connection, or is there a connection, between worldview and behavior? And we have to acknowledge, at least in principle, that it is possible for people to act in a way which is inconsistent with their view of the world. Something very important to realize. So how do we account for that in this discussion? Now here I think it becomes very important to link worldview back to this notion of religion. All worldviews, I take it as, and I can't argue this now, but all worldviews are matters of trust, of taking the world as meaningful in some way that is not provable universally. Okay, so in a sense, if everybody has a worldview, in a sense, worldviews are hidden. They're often not made explicit unless they go into some kind of crisis. And at the heart of a worldview is trust. I simply trust that reason is the best guide to living an excellent life. Okay? Or I trust that, that putting my faith in Jesus Christ is the best way to living an excellent life. In other words, worldviews actually sound an awful lot like religions. Now, I would say that all worldviews have a religious core, not in the sense of unprovable ideas, but as practices, of practices of bending one's life towards something. I would say further that these practices not only display a worldview, but they also shape a worldview. In other words, I'm thinking of what Michael Ignatieff talks about, the visceral feeling that he gets when he walks into an Orthodox church, even though he himself is not a believer in a sort of a traditional Christian understanding of God, you know. But that sense that he has is because of the practices into which he was inaugurated growing up in the home that he grew up in. And you find also with Catholic filmmakers like Martin Scorsese. You know, people have written illuminating articles on Scorsese's Catholic and sacramental way of making films. Right? I mean, it gets very deep in you. Even if at a kind of a belief level you no longer accept it, at a kind of a gut or heart level it still shaped you profoundly. So we have to talk about this as well as just talking about ideas. Yeah, simple illustration. It's fairly recent memory. Since September the 11th, sports in the United States have become a powerful occasion for the display of patriotism, what we might call the religion of America. But they've also served to reinforce that sense of meaning and order and belonging shattered in the aftermath of those attacks. So we see, anybody here want to admit they watched the Super Bowl? Okay? This is not the kind of audience I would expect to have watched. But I watched the Super Bowl. I recorded and watched it after church. So military honor guards preceding the competitors. The acknowledgement of servicemen and women watching in faraway lands at this very moment, creating a sense of communion, as well as the acknowledgement of those who have sacrificed themselves for the sake of the nation, making this communion a true communion of saints. We have the national anthem rendered, however badly, by a celebrity saint who in some ways is an icon of America, right? Christina Aguilera as an icon of America. And we have all of this combined with agents of that other great American religion called capitalism. Okay? Now the game itself is secondary, but it's also important, because the game represents two heroic groups having survived the agonistic ordeal of the NFL regular season, clashing until one is victorious. But then in the post-game, when the world champions have been crowned, there's the ritual acknowledgement of the worth of the opponent and the privilege of having borne witness to what makes America great. What makes the Super Bowl so powerful is not just that it expresses patriotism. It also reinforces, recreates, and reshapes the religion of America. For 5 hours on a Sunday afternoon, Americans forget their petty differences and participate in something bigger, something that reminds them at a deep and profound level of who they are. Now, I'm mentioning all this because the problem that often bedevils conversations around religion amongst intellectuals, and especially amongst the intellectuals that I've mentioned, like Hitchens and Harris and so forth, is that religion often gets reduced to a set of ideas, which are either to be accepted or rejected, when really, for most people, religion is a set of practices. Right? It's something that you do with your body that both expresses but also shapes your ideas. So, if you want to understand the religion of America, don't read the founding documents of the United States. I'll tell you nothing about the religion of America. Right? But go to a football game, right? Or go to a Memorial Day service, or go to a celebration of the 4th of July, right? And watch. And there you will see in people's actions, in their displays, the way they bow at certain moments within the liturgy of the religion of America, the hand over the heart, all of these things. These are gestures which inculcate that religion into people's inner beings. So likewise, when we talk about a theistic worldview, we have to look at the practices. We have to look at how Christians, Jews, Muslims worship, right? As giving us important clues. Well, I've talked for, I don't know how long I've talked for. I took my watch off. But, yeah, okay. Well, yeah.
Not that long.
Yeah, it's okay. All right, okay. So I can make my final point. My final point is really a statement, and it's a kind of a confessional statement. Okay, so here I'm going to put my cards on the table as a Christian theologian. When we talk about the excellent life, we are assuming, I think, that humans are for something. In philosophical language, we are using teleological language. Okay, we're saying that humans are for something, right? That there is a purpose or a telos to human life. And as I said in the beginning, we may not be able to agree on the particulars of that telos. Some might even say that the telos is merely formal. That at the end of human life, or that the end of human life for each individual is simply to create meaning in an essentially meaningless universe. Or the end of human life is to achieve autonomy. Or the end of human life is to achieve a legacy, right? Something to pass on to generations so that you will be remembered. Or that the end of human life is to realize one's own unique giftedness. Or perhaps most sadly, to come back to the second point I made, the end of human life is to die with the most toys. My own view, which I will call Christian or theological humanism, is this: that we discern the true telos. And by the way, I've got a friend who talks a lot about worldviews. In fact, in many ways, he wrote the book for Christians on worldviews, and he was approached by someone who wanted to do research in Christian colleges and universities to find out if the Christian worldview that they had learned in those colleges and universities had actually taken, right? So 10 years down the line, you would interview these people and try to find out if they still held a Christian worldview. So this person, and this was I think it was a master's thesis project, this person did what people in the social sciences do, unfortunately. If you're in the social sciences, that's okay, bless you. He made a survey. And the survey asked very intellectual types of questions, So what is your view on abortion, right? What is your view on evolution? How would you interpret this particular scripture passage? And my friend got really upset. And he said, let me design for you an alternative questionnaire. It would have questions like this. Can I go through your garbage to see what it is that you're throwing out? Or, do you own a television set? If you own a television set, what room is it in? If it is in your living room, how are the other pieces of furniture arranged relative to the television set? Can I look at your credit card receipts to see what you're spending your money on? Questions like this, which are really questions that get us away from the intellect or the mind. I'm saying that as a preamble to a couple of statements I'm going to make about my own view. You're not allowed to go through my garbage. You're not allowed to check my credit card receipts. You know, I realize as I say this that there is a disconnect, but I'll say it anyway. Okay, so Christian or theological humanism is we discern the true telos of humanity in the humanity of Jesus of Nazareth, whom Christians confess as the Christ. Jesus reveals to us the eschatological shape, that is, the destiny of the human race, as imaging God's generous hospitality and suffering love. Jesus challenges us to form communities that anticipate this final shape. And he does this by giving us rituals. He also gives us commandments, but I really want to focus on the rituals. Christians call these sacraments. And you know, Christians disagree about the number of sacraments and yada, 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 but they pretty well all agree on two. The first is baptism. Baptism incorporates us into a new humanity that knows neither race nor nation, nor is divided on the basis of class or gender difference. Okay? And David has mentioned my work in South Africa. I actually worked for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I did research for them on the role of faith communities under apartheid. Okay? So I know that even when I say this, there are many, many, many examples of how Christians have failed to live up to this. The second is Eucharist. Eucharist sustains that new humanity as one that shares gifts for the common good, which is based not only on hoarding and the struggle for, or not simply, or not at all, on hoarding and the struggle for self-preservation, but on generosity and self-donation. Christians claim that any life that practically lives out these things, and maybe more controversially, we might even claim, or I might even claim, that any life that practically lives out these things, regardless of the beliefs that a person might hold, may truly be called excellent.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Steve. We're going to do this the way we did the last couple times. That is, the first person to raise a theme or issue that they want to put on the table, want to reflect on, I would ask the rest of you to raise your hand if you want to speak to that theme or issue. And after several comments, I will call for another avenue of exploration. It just makes it possible for us to get a little bit farther in our thinking together. So, who would like to raise something off the top here to begin with? David.
Hello?
You're on.
Is this on? Yeah. I'm glad you finally came clean at the end and mentioned Jesus Christ. I think that you were too generous with what you called gods, namely, and I saw the Super Bowl too, and I thought there was entirely too much hype. It's just a game, but that's neither here nor there. I mean, getting and spending is maybe a god. National reverence may be a god, but I would call that idolatry. I mean, those are gods with a small g, not a capital G. And I would put Jesus Christ as a Christian with a capital G for God. Right. Would you care to speak to that at all?
I agree 100%.
But I would like to just add a footnote. You must appreciate that there was a Hail Mary at the end of the game. Anybody else want to pursue that or the next approach?
Yes, would you say that the telos,
Closer,
the
right?
telos of life revealed through Jesus as the goal of life to manifest the generosity and self-donation of God. And while you acknowledge that those who do not subscribe to the Christian system doctrines may also manifest that in their behavior,
Yes.
which of course I agree with, is it not also true that through other traditions, religions, systems of thought, this purpose of life can be discovered? Like when you say that it is revealed through Jesus' life, of course people will say, well, what of those who have no knowledge whatever of that life? And I would suggest that we need to be open to the same discovery, or a discovery leading to the same end can be made through other traditions, religious or whatever.
David, I would say that I just oh, sorry.
No, but I'm actually much more interested in people responding to this.
Do you want to respond to that?
You know, I can make an intervention as well, but yeah, it's sufficiently interesting.
Yes, thanks. I appreciate what this young man is saying, but I've been invited first time since the mall opened in '78 by the Gervesian brothers as the senior pastor there to establish a mainline presence. And Pastor Bob Gale wants me to wear my clerical collar, which I'm not wearing right now. But so when I go ice skating with the seniors, I'll be wearing my collar. As I roam and meet people working in those 900 businesses that are going through difficulty, or sit in the food kiosk, which is a really big one, by the way, having a milkshake, I'll be wearing my collar. But I have to be very sensitive that that's like a melting pot of the world. When I was in Russia preaching, in Finland, in Ukraine, I got to tell you, all I got to do is mention Edmonton. Now that Wayne Gretzky is gone, they used to, at '92 after the wall came down, they used to say, we know Edmonton, Wayne Gretzky, and West Edmonton Mall. So I have to be extremely sensitive, in spite of my dress, to other religions and people of no religion, or people that worship football, or etc. Thanks, Dr. Stephen.
I suppose that is saying that West Edmonton Mall is a temple.
Yes.
I have a bit of a problem with the underlying criticism of the Super Bowl. It seems to me that the Super Bowl, as a religion, that's the wrong approach. A visit of the Pope, for instance, is a religion. The visit of Kate and William is similarly so. But I think if you look at all of these things, the Super Bowl included, the visit of the Pope, Kate Middleton, it's really an entertainment. It's something you can do, watch, in between going and getting your beer. But as far as establishing any dominance, I don't see that, again, I go back to the visit of the Pope, or the Super Bowl, or the hockey teams or anything like that is any different. They all take our mind off, but we may not want to listen about it. But the idea that the Super Bowl is a religion should be dealt with in the same manner as any other entertainment.
Even if the Green Bay Packers are in it?
I'd settle for the Toronto Maple Leafs in this situation.
Do you want to comment on?
Well, yeah. It was an illustration of something, but you know, I'll stand behind it. I think there is something called Sportsism that we can align along with the other isms of our society: patriotism, nationalism, consumerism, and so forth. You know, wherein, I mean, a classical definition of idolatry is to take a piece of the creation, whether we're talking about the natural creation, and there's a lovely chapter in Isaiah where the prophet gives a phenomenology of the construction of an idol, where you cut down a tree, and what you can't use as firewood, you sort of carve into something and bow down and worship it. Essentially, you're taking a part of the good creation, and you're investing. It's almost like you're making a fetish, right? You're investing the meaning of your life in that one object. Okay, so yeah, I mean, what I'm talking about are different varieties and versions of idolatry. I think that's, the Bible is also quite clear that there is one image, right, that God has set up on earth that is rightfully called the divine image, and that's us. Okay? Human beings are created in the image of God, created to reflect God to the creation. And anything that takes away from the reflection of God's glory to the creation, especially idolatry, is not only an affront to God, it's also an affront to us. Okay? It's a dehumanization. Now, as far as the mall goes, I mean, one of the things that I try to do, I do work on ritual and liturgy, and one of the things that I try to do in that is to talk about the ways that what have traditionally been associated with churches, modernity has sort of displaced the church, but we find church-like things in other parts of our society. And one example of that would be a rock concert. If you want to think about analogies between a church service, especially an African American church service, right, and a rock concert. Okay, so when you suppress, what we would call in kind of the cultural sense religious institutions, those things actually show up elsewhere. I think there are secular forms of communion. There are secular liturgies, which it's important for us to reflect when we look at these secular liturgies, that just as a Christian liturgy is supposed to inculcate and shape what Christians would call abundant life, or what we would say, maybe in more general terms, the excellent life. So these other liturgies also inculcate a sense of the excellent life. So if you go to West Edmonton Mall, which I try not to, I find when I go to West Edmonton Mall, I used to be Pentecostal, and I think about the old language I used to use of spiritual warfare. I feel like I'm battling spirits, right? Because they all want a piece of me. And my credit card starts to vibrate like my phone, so, in other words, my desire is activated by these things. But when you go to the mall, I mean, not only is the space shaped in very theological kinds of ways, but there are icons everywhere. Where's David? Yeah. There are icons everywhere, okay? This is what you can look like. This is what a beautiful human person looks like. This is what a successful human person looks like. And they're everywhere in the mall, and you can participate in that beauty, in that success through, well, the tingling credit card, actually. Buying the product that will allow you to share in the goodness, the beauty, the excellence of this image that is placed in front of you. So I think that's profoundly religious, And one of the things that what we might call the positive religions, Christianity, and I think especially Islam. Islam is far more sensitive, I think, to idolatry than Christianity is in many cases. is to shape people in alternative ways, right? So that they will find resources to not participate in what I would consider to be dehumanizing ways of making and understanding. So.
Good. We have another approach here.
Well, it's going to be the same kind of question, I think. I'd like to tempt you and others maybe to say a little more about the excellence of the religious life. But I'd like to get you to say that because I'd like to understand it better, and I don't. So let me just say about myself. I'm a long time ago in my life, I was a practicing Catholic and a football player. It's been a long time since I was either one of those things. I wasn't very good at either of them, I'm sure, at the time, but it's been a long, long time since then. So now, I can see that a person who watches football every Sunday or Saturday, that might be an excellent life. I can see that's a possibility, but I don't see that it is, and I don't have the foggiest idea why it might be. And the same is true for the Christian you described in your closing comments. I can see that a Christian or other religious or spiritual practice could be like a core element of a really worthy and excellent life. I can see that that's possible, but I don't see that it is true. And I'd like you to say something, if you would, about like what it is that is true, what it is that makes for that flourishing and excellent life.
Do you want to let some other people?
No. Why don't you pick it up?
Yeah. Okay.
Start with.
It's difficult to answer that very good question in the abstract. I can only answer it by pointing to saints, people that I know who I would say live an excellent or have lived an excellent life, and in my case. Two of them are South Africans. One is Desmond Tutu, and I think that Desmond Tutu exemplifies things that aren't known about Tutu that are kind of below the tip of the iceberg. Are Tutu's own devotion to Anglo-Catholicism. And to spending time in prayer and meditation. In his biography of Tutu, John Allen states that for every hour that Tutu spends in public, and if you've ever, how many of you have ever actually been present at something that Tutu has done? Like
He's been on this campus.
Yeah. You know how gregarious and outgoing and extroverted he is. But for every hour that that he spends in public, he spends at least an hour in prayer and meditation. So I would say someone like Tutu would embody the kind of self-giving, self-donation, living in a way which risks his own life for the sake of justice and others. Another example, maybe not from South Africa, would be someone like Archbishop Oscar Romero.
Yeah.
Both of these are archbishops. I don't know if that's a coincidence, but and their lives, and you can look at people as well. Someone like Mahatma Gandhi, who is not a Christian, but Tutu has this. Actually, it's not Tutu. It's John Howard Yoder, the Mennonite theologian, who once made a statement that that people who follow the way of Jesus, particularly in nonviolence, are acting with the grain of the universe. Okay, Tutu's way of putting that is to say that we live in a fundamentally moral universe. That that God has made the world in such a way that evil may be able to flourish for a time, but it is against the grain of the universe. I'm not sure how far I want to go with that, but that's what he says. So in kind of giving, I don't know if this is, if Don, this is going to satisfy you, but
It's great.
But generally, what I would want to do is point to saints You know, not necessarily those who have been canonized by the church, but those who exemplify, those whose lives image Jesus, and particularly saints that have gone to the point of being martyrs. Dietrich Bonhoeffer might be another, right? Someone whose life would say that ultimately the power of death, and again, I'm a theologian. I can't help it. Okay, so I'm going to speak as a theologian.
Would you all bless him?
If
you all bless him,
yes. So yeah, my priest is actually here. So, but speaking as a Christian theologian, I would say that the forces of oppression are forces of death. And someone who is able to give their lives in the face of the forces of oppression, a Bonhoeffer or a Romero, and yet would do so in a way in the hope of what Christians call the resurrection, is someone who testifies that ultimately the power of death is not the final word in human life. Right? So the martyr is especially important for Christian. Martyr in the sense of martyrian, one who bears witness, not martyr in the sense of someone who might strap explosives to their body, and that's not a Christian understanding of a martyr. A martyr has to do in Christian witness with someone who is engaged in self-donation, right? In giving themselves, and I would say giving themselves non-violently for the sake of the world.
It's also not a Muslim idea of a martyr either.
Right.
Thank you. Just a quick question, sort of pick up on what you've been responding to in Don's question. It seems to be the importance of participation in understanding something. So understanding about God, knowing God involves participation somehow. So participating in this particular kind of life. Yet some friends of mine call that participation sort of indoctrination. So it doesn't give you an objective stance from which to, philosophically critique the whole God question. And on the other hand, participation is important in terms of understanding this. Could you just elaborate on that little difficulty and how to help me through it?
Okay. Well, I can answer it very, very quickly, and I guess cryptically, I'm not trying to be a smartass when I say this, but I don't believe there's any such thing as objectively separating yourself from something. Like, I don't believe there's any such thing as objectivism, okay? You're always participating in something, right? And arguably, and if there are theologians here, then I'm shaking in, sorry, if there are philosophers here, especially epistemologists here, then I'm shaking in my boots because I'm way out of my field. But even if you are professing to be objective, then you are participating in a discourse of objectivism, right? Which is a discourse that's got its own particular history, right? So, but that said, it's important to realize, as I was sort of implying in my little talk, that Christians, Muslims, Jews, secularists, Marxists, whatever, participate in multiple forces, right? So, we're sitting around here, we're drinking tea. What are the global economic forces that we are participating in, right? And some of those things that we participate in may contradict even our most deeply held beliefs. I drove here. I hate the oil sands, right? But I drove here in my car, right? Which is powered by gas that, who knows whether, does our oil actually go here, or does it go to the U.S. and we actually consume Saudi oil in our cars? I don't know. But yeah, it goes there and it comes back here, yeah. So in many ways, whether consciously or unconsciously, we are participants in multiple, right? And maybe one of the things that we need to do is be more aware of the ways that we participate in these forces, some of which are forces of death.
Okay, just to help me out here. So basically, participation is all the time.
Yes.
It's ever occurring. And so the whole idea is to situate that within a particular context of discourse,
yes,
for example. And so where possible, like in scientific discourse, there's much more room for, you know, relative objectivity. But in this particular instance, when we're talking about knowing God, there's more of a requirement of participation in order to understand what's going on.
Yeah, yeah, and one of the things that that'll probably frustrate the hell out of people is when you know, the Psalms say, "Taste and see that the Lord is good," and it's kind of like, well, I'd like you to tell me about the goodness of the Lord, but I'm not sure I want to taste it. You know, you know, maybe in some ways this points to an important limitation of interreligious dialogue, which our brother raised at the very beginning. You know, I can only go so far with my Muslim friends, and I learned a lot about my own Christian beliefs by doing my doctoral studies in a department which had a strong Islamic studies component to it at the University of Cape Town. And I actually became far more rooted in my Christian faith through observing the practices of my Muslim friends in that department. Just sounds like a paradox, right? But it wasn't, you know. I mean, but I can only go so far in understanding Islam without actually becoming a Muslim. Okay. Then on the inside, of course, it looks different. I mean, Stanley Hauerwas, who's a theologian, very controversial theologian, real badass theologian, if you want to be a badass theologian. And his complaint about religious studies. Are there religious studies people here? Oh God. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, this is what.
But all the religious studies people that are here are badass.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, my degree's from religious studies department, so I guess I put my hand up too. He says the problem with religious studies is you've got to kill it before you can study it. Okay, so you've got to you know, in a sense, before you can study from a religious studies perspective, before you can study Christianity, you've got to kill it, put it on an autopsy bench, and then carve it open. But you're no longer dealing with something that's living and contesting and negotiating and all this kind of thing, right? So yeah.
So
You have to hold it here.
Basically, I wanted to talk about the question, and also earlier when we were talking about, well, what about non-religion? And addressing the actual question, whether it's a help or a hindrance, and looking at there are people who practice a religion, but do not practice it fully. They take different aspects of it, moderate it, or to how they see it, and they use that to what's the word I'm looking for? To justify, no, not justify, but internalize what they believe their values and beliefs are. And so, in the sense that it's not really, you're looking at the religion or the practice specifically, but more what you take from it in order to make it an excellent life for yourself.
Yes.
And so I don't think that we can actually just say, oh look, atheists, you know, and just break it down, and the religion as a whole, or what your community of the religion is, because even in the end, you're still by yourself, and that's what you perceive the religion to be as.
Right.
Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes?
No, go if you have a response, because mine's already the topic.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, I mean, I'd be very interested in what people have to say as well, but let me throw something else out. Reginald Bibby, any sociologists here? Okay, good. Oh, there's one. Okay, yes. Bless you, sir. Yeah, Reginald Bibby is a sociologist down at Lethbridge, and he's kind of a guru to, actually he's a guru to a lot of Christians, you know.
A lot of clergy, too.
A lot of clergy, yeah, yeah. About 20 years ago, he published a book called Fragmented Gods, and he made the claim that most Canadians like their religion a la carte. Okay, not Descartes, but the cart. You know, in the sense that they see, you know, religion has become fragmented into various practices. So it's like, okay, I'll have a little bit of Zen meditation. I'll have a little bit of sort of lectio divina. I'll have a little bit of you know, I don't know. Sufi poetry, right? And I'll put it into a mix. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's called spirituality, right? Yeah, and I'll put this into a mix which will satisfy myself. And I mean, a lot of people are like that, and you know, I mean, it's going to happen inevitably. You know, I mean, any religion that doesn't admit to a little bit of syncretism is probably not being entirely honest with itself. But the problem with that is that the person who determines what constitutes an excellent life is still the self, right? So ultimately, it's individualism, but with decoration, right? With like an orange. Is this orange?
It's orange.
Yeah, with an orange shirt and green pants and you know whatever. So then spiritual practices become subordinated to the kind of preferences or the taste of the person who is putting those things on, and it's a I mean, that particular kind of thing that Bibi is describing, I think, is very much a reflection of the mall culture. Very much a reflection of the mall culture. Sorry.
Did you wish to?
Yes, I did.
No, go ahead.
All right.
Would anyone want to? Before you go, would anyone want to follow up on that?
So.
Sorry.
Do you mind if
You're
I pick up on this one? Yes. So are you saying then that to have an excellent life or to live an excellent life, one needs to make a choice and one needs to belong to a particular worldview, be it Christianity or other religious worldviews, that one can't find it within themselves then to live an excellent life?
I would say that in the quest to live an excellent life, I would advise someone to place themselves fully within a religious tradition, right? And to go where that tradition. Some of you are groaning. Okay. Well, bring it on. Bring it on. You know, I mean, ultimately, you know. Ultimately, religion, if we talk about the religions, right, is about the displacement of the self. Okay? It's not the displacement of the self because the self is bad, evil, dirty, but it's the displacement of the self for the sake of its healing and transformation. Okay? So if you simply take on a certain set of religious practice, you're not really displacing the self, okay? It's still you that's in control. Okay? Now, I know that's controversial, so I'm sorry. Is your question on this?
No, it's going back to something you said
earlier. Okay. Yeah, because this seems to have a little bit of juice to it. So if you wouldn't mind, if somebody else wants to respond to this, maybe some of those who have been making faces at me for the last 30 seconds, we'll come back to you. You'll be up next.
I mean, another take on this is religion is a discipline.
Yes.
And playing the violin is a discipline. Being a fine baseball player is a discipline. You cannot participate in 15 disciplines and become excellent at them. For one thing, you never get to the end of yourself around it. So that's at least part of what I hear you say.
I'm going to comment on this now. Okay, so you guys all seem to think that if you're not following somebody else's ideas, you're wrong. This seems like a strange idea to me because I, personally, am interested in a lot of things. And by having a lot of interests, all of those interests complement everything else. For example, if you play violin and all you play is violin, how would you know how to dance to violin? That seems like an awfully bad idea, in case you go to a dance, right? And for spirituality and such, why would you want to have a religion that says thou must do this and this and this and this? And you're looking down this list and I'm like, I don't like that one, but I like everything else in this list. But because I don't like that one, I guess I must go find a new religion. That seems like a dumb idea.
I don't think he's saying that. Why don't you answer, Dave?
Did you want to pick up on this?
I feel like I'm a bit of an interloper here. I was just here to write my report and drink some tea. But since you're all...
So was I.
But so I had a couple of thoughts, so I thought I'd contribute to the extent I could. Okay, thank you. It seems to me that the teachings of Jesus and Christianity go against the concept of organized religion, because what Christianity says is that we're all made in God's image, and if we're made in God's image, then God is in us, and then by looking inward, we can obtain a closer connection to God and to truth. So, if anything, what Jesus said was, don't look to your organized and man-made structures to find the truth. Look inward, and you'll find God there. The second point I wanted to make, or maybe it's more of a question, is I'm having a bit of trouble understanding the relationship you're establishing between materialism, capitalism, Maoism, as you said, and how it somehow devalues or conflicts or interrupts Christianity or religion. And just empirically, what I see is actually just the opposite. If you look at some of the most materialistic or consumer-based cultures in the world, like the United States or South Korea, they're the most Christian and most religious countries in the world. If you look at countries which have a less dedicated adherence to a market economy, like the countries of Europe in some instances, or in China, they're the least religious countries in the world. So the assumption, the connection there doesn't seem to play out for me from an evidentiary perspective. I'd just like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I do not consider the United States to be a Christian country in any sense of the word. So, I think
it's a churched country.
Yeah,
that was your point. You were making the distinction yourself.
I mean, in a sense, the United States is no more a Christian country than apartheid South Africa was a Christian country. Right?
No, I'm saying people are. If you look at data, sociological data, Americans by far consider themselves Christian more than the populations of any other country in the world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
We need to.
Yeah. We actually need to come back to this question here.
Oh no, I was going to comment on that too. Yeah.
Oh, okay, all right.
If you were going to comment on that, then I'll take the comment over here.
Well, actually, I think one of the points that I want to make is already made in a different form. And basically, I have nothing to add to your point that we have a multitude of religion within our society. But I think my point, and it's a fundamental question, do we need any religion? Whether it's Christian, Muslim, going to the mall, or going to the Super Bowl, or whatever. Isn't it possible, and to give you a good example of a non-religious person, I would think Christ was a very good one, because he said, in a way, throw out the religion and follow your heart, right? So in a way, the point he was making. There is a very great difference between what you're proposing as a system and being able to live independently, if you want, without religion of any form, whether it's nationalism, Catholicism, Maoism, or whatever.
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge. I guess it remains to be seen whether it's possible for humans to live in communities without something that would bind them together, and some common commitment, living out some narrative. Yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment. I'd be interested in knowing what it might look like. So if we come back to this question of excellence, what would an excellent life without religion look like positively? I mean, it might look like John Lennon's Imagine, you know, but unfortunately John Lennon's Imagine is quite nihilistic, you know, in the sense that it's sort of take all these things away and you get something that is more appealing or attractive. Now, let me just say something about religious institutions. I mean, in some ways, a theologian named Bill Kavanaugh once said, being against organized religion is a little bit like being against organized hospitals, you know, organized healthcare. You know, the organization of something does not make it bad, okay? But as far as what I'm talking about, okay, let me speak as a theologian, talking about the church. Rowan Williams, probably one of the greatest living theologians, currently the Archbishop of Canterbury, was once asked the question, what is church? And his response to that question was, church is something that happens. Okay, before it's a thing, it's an event. And church is what happens when people gather around Jesus. Okay, so this gathering around Jesus is what we call church. Or gathering in the memory of Jesus is what we call church. However, there are things that need to be in place in order to sustain the ongoing possibility of that encounter. And those are the things that we normally associate with the institution, right? So sacraments, so some kind of leadership, so some kind of scriptures, you know, because the gathering of people around Jesus is a gathering that is in radical continuity with gatherings that have taken place since the time of Jesus. So you've got to talk about tradition, right? But it's also in radical continuity with the Jews. So you've got to talk about the Hebrew Scriptures and the way that the Christian faith is understandable as one interpretation of those Hebrew Scriptures. Okay, and before you know it, you're not building an institution in the sense of, okay, you need to have a headquarters at Canterbury, and you need to have, but in a sense you're saying that you need stuff to sustain the possibility of this encounter with Jesus down through history, okay? And when theologians talk about the church as institution, that's the sort of thing that they're talking about. But the core of the church remains the encounter, the encounter or the communion with the divine through Jesus, and the encounter or the communion with others, right? Whether others here in a room or others across vast spans of distance and time. So hopefully that clarifies something about what I mean.
You made a good point for the conventional church, but now then couldn't you use the same argument for the Rose Bowl or for nationalism or for consumerism? You know, but so why don't we get rid of them? If we can get rid of consumerism, why can't we get rid of religion?
One's materialistic and one isn't. Sorry? One's materialistic and one isn't.
So what's the difference?
That's not necessarily
What's the problem? They're both selling my mind.
When you're on your deathbed, you will see what the difference is. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I want to talk about this too.
Yeah.
Why don't you raise your other issue?
Pardon? Oh, you want me to raise my other issue?
Go on to what you want to do.
Do you want to talk about this first? Or do you want to go on to the next?
We're going to stop in a moment. So
Okay.
make up your mind.
So my other issue that was previous to this one, I'm sorry for cutting off discussion as such, was the gradient of the world and the whole this earth is made for goodness and such, because the whole concept of good and evil does not seem to be what the earth would want as compared to, you know, self-sustainment. Because if you look at things that have happened in the world, like Stalin, Nazism, witch burnings, Japanese internment camps, I'm pretty sure whoever made those ideas didn't wake up in the morning and was like, I'm gonna be evil today. They probably decided this might be what is best for this earth, in which case they thought they were good. It's just that the people that won that war thought they were not so good. And I'm not saying they are good, just saying. It's just that the idea of the gradient of the earth being good does not make sense, because the people that decide who is good and evil are the people that win the war, in which case they're not necessarily good or evil as much as they're the ones that won the war.
Yeah, although I'm actually glad that that Hitler didn't win the Second World War, and I'm glad that Stalin was ultimately defeated. I mean, I think that the point that Tutu is making about this being a moral universe is simply that evil may flourish for a time, but it will not ultimately prevail. And that's really the only point that Tutu is trying to make, and he's making that with reference to what happened in South Africa. Apartheid was very clearly an evil regime. I mean, as you said, which is a very important point, right? My earlier work was done on a social theorist named Ernest Becker, who made the argument that we actually create evil by trying to rid the world of evil, which I think is a powerful argument, right? And humans are never more ambiguous than when they are unambiguously good, or they think of themselves as unambiguously good. So yeah, but I think just to defend the point that this is, for Tutu anyway, a moral universe. So those who, maybe just to get back to the broader issue here, that those who seek to live an excellent life are seeking to live in fundamental harmony with the nature of the universe.
We need to take a break, and you can refresh your tea pot. We take a break for about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes or so, and then we come back for another 45 minutes, and we'll begin with you. Thank you. And continue our conversation.
When you were a Jesuit, I would think you only need to dream of it.
I think I've experienced. Oh, sorry, I think I've experienced a revelation. It's called English toffee tea. I mean, this is amazing. Wow.
Okay, we have another theme to put on the table here.
Good afternoon, my name is Stephen. I just want to speak to the initial resolution about whether a theistic worldview promotes an excellent life. And I want to comment on accountability, and that I think that one of the things that a theistic worldview does is that for many people it provides an accountability, and it restrains us potentially from a tendency in some situations to harshness or corruption. And so one example I'll give of this is I'm in medicine. And if we look in 400 BC, when Hippocrates was there and wrote the Hippocratic Oath, he was functioning at a time when physicians were being corrupted and bribed and poisoning people and doing all kinds of things. And when he set up the Hippocratic Oath, the first thing that was at the beginning is that physicians should be accountable to transcendent forces, because he recognized that left to their own devices, they were easily corrupted and became involved in inappropriate kind of things. And I believe that for those of us who have a theistic worldview, it does provide an accountability that does restrain us and thus helps us to promote an excellent life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good point.
Yeah, sort of following up on that a little bit. Isn't that, though, to say that a religious worldview is just a crutch? That is that the whole belief that there are transcendent forces which are working toward what we think is good in the world, etc., is something which provides us with something like a kind of moral support for an ethical life. All right. The downside of that is that once you think that morality and ethics is written into the core of the universe by some transcendent power of the mind, well then there's a very strong tendency to think that one sort of ethic, like the ethic which you proposed as the ethic of Jesus Christ, not quite sure I agree that that is Jesus' ethic, but the one you proposed, and a lot of other religions proposed various ethics, is the ethic and the way to live an excellent life. Everybody else's way of living an excellent life is out of step with the transcendent order of the universe. Isn't it really, in the end, and I hesitate to say this because I realize that religion is very important in a lot of people's lives, but isn't it, in the end, more excellent to live without the crutch? That is, it's possible, we know that it's possible for people to live ethical lives without that crutch. And isn't that really living in a better way?
Okay, thank you. Provocative point. I think we have a...
Well, you want to speak to it?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. You're quite animated. I don't need to animate you, so that's good.
It's okay that religion's a crutch for me, because when I went through a divorce in the early 80s, not allowed to serve in Lutheran Church at that time, because I was one of the first in Canada, I needed Jesus. When I've come through a year of burnout, burning the candles, serving for 35 years, I've needed a crutch. Time of depression, I've come out of it now. But there's worse crutches. Alcohol, prescription drugs, tobacco, on and on. Materialism, commercialism. Thank you, David.
Yeah, I think we're back at the question of how we define or how we understand religion, and my preference is to understand religion as a universal feature of human life. Okay, so that's not to say that religion, again, in the original sense of relegio, to bind. That's not to say that what is a universal feature of human life is one particular form of religion. I mean, religion has many forms. Yeah. So in response to the question, isn't it better to live an excellent life without religion? I would not be able to identify what a human life would look like without religion, because I think and I argue and I believe that there's no such thing, right? I mean, you might as well say, wouldn't it be better to live a life without a worldview, right? Yeah. Now, as far as the crutch thing goes, I mean, I think that there is something about religion in its many forms. Each of them will give some account of why the world is not the way it should be, and will assign some kind of therapy, to dealing with one's personal woundedness, as well as with the woundedness of the world. Again, those kinds of things will differ across religions, right? So, for example, if you are most deeply and profoundly shaped by the religion of America, and you are wounded by the sight of planes flying into buildings and burning the flesh of thousands of people, your therapy might be to strike back in violence, okay, as a way of dealing with that sense of brokenness. That's not to say that it's good that you do that. You know, I would want to criticize such a thing, but I can only criticize such a thing from my own religious perspective, which is something committed to the, you know, as you said, the ethics of Jesus. Okay.
I just want to make it clear that the thing that I'm objecting to is not religion in a very vague and general sense in which you seem to use the term. But what I'm objecting to is theism, right? Okay. I mean, a religion which grounds itself in the theistic view of the world.
You want to speak to the theism issue? No, just a moment,
Yeah.
Did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, but again, you know, as I've said, I think that my vague and general definition of religion also carries a sort of a universal. The other side of the coin is the God, small g God, that you build your life around. So again, a non-theistic religion is also not possible, right? We all have a God, even if the God is ourselves.
This is the 18th century coming up against religious perspectives.
Well, I just wanted to comment to the image that came up in my mind in terms of crutch. And when I see the image of a crutch, it seems like a very limited kind of image to what some people might consider to be a relationship, and certainly the complexity of that in many ways that relationship can be there. And so, yeah, I just wanted to put out there that certainly words have power and they create images, but they're just one image, and it might be simplistic in terms of what is really much more complex than that. And I guess for myself, what really came up was that that's an idea, but I would kind of hold with whatever that is, relationship.
There are, if I just make a comment, for a number of years, I never used the word religion. I would always say that Christianity is not a religion, Christianity is a relationship, right? I would still agree with that, but I also want to rehabilitate the term religion, you know, which is kind of a dirty word in our culture. You know, I want to rehabilitate religion, but in a way that is more faithful to its original meaning, which has to do with the way that people bind themselves to each other in relationship. So that's very good. And the way that they bind themselves to that which they consider to be of ultimate worth or significance in the world. So ways of binding, yeah. But I realize that what you're saying by relationship is very much what I would affirm when I talk about religion.
Just two very quick observations, actually. And I find it unhelpful, quite frankly, to regard secular and political ideologies as religions, even though it could be argued as systematized sets of ideas, they have things in common, but the lack of theism is a big difference. But I don't really want to get into an argument about that as someone who's also committed to a worldview which has been very hostile in some respects to the one that you yourself represent or are opposing. I'm kind of looking for attempts to reach out and find perhaps some common interfaces here. And I would like to throw forward that the idea of whether you have a religious worldview or I have a political worldview, there are certain important things in this point in time, I think, historically, which we should be seeking to advance, and one of those things is to ensure that our worldviews are reflexive to start with. They are critically reflexive. As a Marxist, I have to take responsibility in my own mind for what Stalin did, for what happened in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, in Ethiopia under the Derg. As a Christian, you have to take equal responsibility for the Crusades, for the genocides that happened in South America, for the burning of witches, and God knows, for slavery and all sorts of other things. So I think critical introspection and reflexivity on our respective worldviews is really important. I also think that understanding the relativism of our worldview is really important, because as a Marxist, my tradition has been as heavily evangelical as yours as a Christian. But the time has come when we have to rein in that evangelism, and we have to respect the rights of other people to pursue their own worldviews on the understanding that they don't try to impose them, they don't indulge in that kind of cultural imperialism, unfortunately, which we've experienced historically right up to the present point. So I guess my point is, if a Marxist and a Christian can come together in any sense, and they certainly can in terms of the social gospel traditions, for civil rights, for anti-war activities and stuff like that, and maybe with Shia movements for social justice in the Islamic world, and Buddhists for social justice. I mean, there are many points of political interface, but we have to be far more introspective and critical about the way in which we hold our views, because the content of what we actually believe is less important than the way in which we actually hold those views.
I would affirm 95% of what you said. And the 95% that I would affirm wholeheartedly. You know, I mean, the South African experience is an experience of Christians and Muslims and atheists, communists marching together. Because they all agreed, they may not have been able to agree completely on the kind of society that could be considered just. And I think that some of the things that have happened in South Africa since then have shown up the disagreements, right? But they certainly could agree what was unjust. Okay, so the apartheid regime was unjust, but Christians were marching for Christian reasons. You know, the South African Communist Party, good old-fashioned Leninist Party, was marching for good old-fashioned Leninist reasons. The Congress of Trade Unions was, you know, I mean, people were doing it for reasons that came out of their own worldviews, their own ideologies, their own deepest beliefs about the human condition. But they were marching together because they recognized that while they may not have been able to agree on what we might call the ultimate, they could certainly agree on the penultimate. Right, so I think that what we're seeing now in global solidarity movements are movements that involve Christian people and local grassroots activist groups and all kinds of people. I also think that what you said about reflexivity is very important, but what allows me to be reflexive about my Christian worldview is not only listening to you, criticize it from your perspective, okay? Because none of us has a perspective that floats in the air, okay? We all occupy turf, ground, okay? So from the ground that you stand on, you tell me what it is that you see. You know, not only when I articulate my view, but when you look at my life, when you go through my garbage or read my credit card receipts or whatever, and likewise with me as well. In many ways, maybe I could use this illustration to refer to something that was said earlier in the discussion. There's a South African Muslim theologian named Farid Isaac, he talks about teaching in a Catholic university in the American Midwest. Every year, a bus would go down to New Mexico to one of the plants that manufactures the materials for nuclear weapons. And would go, and a big school bus would go down from this little college right? This little Catholic college to protest. And on the bus would be Catholics and Protestants, Jews, Buddhists, atheists, Marxists, all kinds. And on the bus, they would argue vociferously about what it is that they believed, right? But they were arguing on the bus, on the way to a sort of a common action, which reflected their senses of what justice was. So and I've often thought about that, because often what happens with interreligious dialogue is it's kind of like a zoo. You know, so behind this cage you've got your Catholic, behind this cage you've got your Theravada Buddhist, behind this cage you've got, and so these are hermetically sealed things, but far better interreligious dialogue is sort of on the bus, right? It's on the way somewhere. It's not the destination. It's part of the journey. So yeah, thank you so much for what you said. And I've even forgotten what the 5% that I disagree with was. So.
Maybe following on the same thing, an understanding, acceptance of evolution, positive relationships with integrity, survival. That's what's made our human community go for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and possibly even part of the animal kingdom.
Thank you.
Hi. I don't have a specific comment or point to make, but rather a recommendation of a book that I read this Christmas that really addresses the question of whether an excellent life can be best achieved through a theistic or completely sort of non-religious, although I appreciate your point about there is no non-religious life. But it was a book called The Question of God. And I'm frustrated with myself because I can't remember the author, but it was by a professor at Harvard. And the book compared the lives of C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud. And it was a fascinating book because, as many of you know, I'm sure, C.S. Lewis is a brilliant theologian, but he didn't come to his belief until about his mid-30s. And he actually had an extremely similar life story to the well-known atheist Sigmund Freud up until this time, in that they both had extremely traumatic childhoods, the loss of significant parent figures, and really struggled and went through a period of sort of extreme atheism when they wrote both of them wrote brilliant sort of atheistic works up until that time. But then C.S. Lewis came to a point in his life, and through many friends and influences and a group of writers called the Inklings that he was part of, where he came to a belief in God. And then his life took a dramatically different trajectory after that point, whereas Sigmund Freud sort of never made that ultimate decision. And their lives in terms of what their ultimate goals and purposes and the community that they surrounded themselves with and the longevity of their relationships really differed after that point. So I don't want to give too much of it away, but for any of you who are really curious about how those types of life paths differ, I found it a really compelling argument.
Thank you. It's I would commend it. It's a good book. So thank you.
I just have a quick question. Can a culture survive where you have widespread mutually exclusive worldviews? And the second thing is, how do politicians govern where you have mutually exclusive worldviews?
Those are very modest questions. Did you want to pick up on this?
Well, I think it sounds weird. Okay, anyways, but in terms of talking about different religions and non-religions, it's all set on a base of principles, and I think you can agree that on a certain level, regardless of what religion you practice or non-religion you practice, you have a common set of values that you believe in, that there should be a sense of rights, equal rights, responsibilities. And so on that basis, that's what the governments govern on. And so I don't think the problem is how do you govern all these different people with different worldviews, but the question is, how do you unite people based on the similarities of those worldviews?
Do you want to respond to that? You want to push it?
I just want to say that you talked about religion being a thing that binds. But if you have mutually exclusive perspectives in religions, then you have things that divide, potentially. So can a culture that does not have an underlying force that is binding them together survive? And if you are governing and in a position of political office where you are trying to unite a culture and to have a common vision to take your nation forward, is it possible, if you do not have that common element that binds and you have competing forces that are at you to further their own self-interest? I'd be really curious for your perspective.
Well, I think if you want to know how to do it, it's quite simple. You just declare war on somebody. You know, I mean, who was it that wrote that book that said that war is a thing that gives us meaning? Okay, so what you do if you've got a diversity, a plurality within one situation, what will bring that people together, create unity, is a common enemy.
Right.
Right. And I think that's if I can speak as a Christian, recognizing as my friend has said, the deep ambiguities within Christian history. But if there's one thing that Jesus taught us, it is that the enemy is not to be rejected, but the enemy is to be loved, even if it costs you your life.
That's the word. That's the word I was going to say. Four-letter word, not the bad one either.
Is that it? Not adequate.
David?
Want to push it? Yeah, I will. I will.
Alright, going back to the underlining forces, where it seemed like you think religion's the only underlining force. Why would you need to have a country based entirely upon religion? Look at Canada. While we do celebrate only Christian national holidays, which I find rather strange, our country is not entirely Christian. Far from it. And we have far more underlining forces. For example, not letting the Americans steal all of our water. Or, just take over in general. But, like, living, having happiness, food. There's all kinds of different underlining forces that you can use to unite people without having to have religion as one of them.
Okay. Going back to when you brought up Ernest Becker, I'm reading about him in psychology, and it's actually really interesting. But Ernest Becker was not existentialist, but we're also talking about existentialism. And I don't think you can get more divided than existentialism. It's self-relative, and your life gives meaning from what meaning you give to it. But where does it come in the solidarity of uniting people? And where that comes in is that you need validation of your values and of your beliefs. And in trying to achieve that validation, that's where people get united. And we have this discussion or communication in order to achieve that validation. So another connective force is that, yes, we do have these different views, but we need to also work together in order to make those different views possible, if that makes sense. Yes? Okay.
Well, one of the things that I see going on here is the difference or the distinction that can be made between culture. What does it mean to have a culture, which is a web of significance that is always small and deep? And what does it mean to live within a civil society where you have many cultural worlds? And how does that civil society and the politicians, the people that govern it, how do they work with that dynamic? And we have I mean, my sense is that part of what's happened, certainly here in Canada, and a bit in the United States too, although it's a quite different story, is that we've endeavored to, there are some who've endeavored to replace culture with the civil canopy. But the civil canopy is always thin and broad. Awfully important for the negotiation between cultures and between the various aspirations of people, but itself is not large enough for one human life. The civil life, modern liberal democratic society, and the great gift of human rights legislation, despite its limits, its gifts as well, from a civil perspective helps with that negotiation. But to replace a life, to replace your whole, to assume you can make a culture out of that is, of course, one of the great struggles, I think, of the 20th century, and increasingly in ours as well. So I think our colleague here pointed to the value of common sense of rights and responsibilities in the civil sphere. But those are different. Very important, unbelievably important, but they're not the same as people who have deep and thick cultural worlds.
If we don't believe that we can, with all our differing religions, find enough common ground in our shared humanity and our human needs, along with the civil things, we have to be terribly pessimistic, because the world is going, more and more countries are going to be made up of people of diverse religious traditions, and that's why I say, I've argued many times, that it's crucial that in this modern world with this challenge that Canada absolutely do its utmost to show that we can make that work and find enough common ground in our humanity.
You want to respond to that, Steve?
Yeah. I'm certainly aware of the challenge that Canada faces. The problem with liberal modernity is that it has resolved the question of living with difference by constructing another worldview, which has said that at bottom we are all individuals, right? We are all atomistic units. As Pierre Trudeau once famously said, there are no groups. Right? Ontologically, there are no groups. There are only individuals who freely associate themselves into groups. So you can only deal with people as individuals, right? That's been the route that Canada has taken, and I think that we're starting to reap, in our own cultural fragmentation, the fruits of that. We have no shared, I mean, we can talk about, well, we should be united by trying to be happy, but we have no shared concept of what happiness is. We have no shared or little shared concept of what justice is. And probably this is more, the U.S. is more radically individualist than Canada is, I think with the rise of the Tea Party, it makes me greatly pessimistic for civil futures, right? The creation of spaces like this one. And maybe we can only create spaces like this on a small scale, where people who inhabit different worldviews, different perspectives, different traditions, can come together and talk over tea, But can you achieve that on a national scale? I'm very dubious.
Thank you. I got a compliment. So you've been doing this since 1 o'clock. It's now 3:15. So I'd like to just take the conversation a bit of a different direction. Sort of under the surface, there's been a lot of implicit questions about method. For example, whether it's an understanding of how can we appreciate diversity, how can we look for commonality among diversity, how do we do that? How do we methodically look at that? Looking at, just I'd like to get your thoughts on method, like theological method, for example. We have a need for looking at finding common foundations, yet respecting diversity, and yet, is there a way that you can approach your particular area in theology, like methodologically, which can somehow accommodate some of that diversity, yet look for some sort of commonality that can be communicate itself across a really diverse culture? Does that make any sense? Does the question make any sense? It's basically a question about method.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of theological departments and universities that address this.
Yeah.
No.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's my own area of theology is political theology. And my specialization is South African political theology. Okay, so it's becoming at a certain point it becomes difficult for me to say something useful in response to the question. I mean, one of the things that I've been working on in my most recent sabbatical was I looked at ritual and liturgical formations in post-apartheid South Africa, and especially with the what happened in South Africa after 1994. And partly this has to do with the forces of globalization and the need for South Africa to develop a means of empowering the majority, right? Most of whom were without homes, without health care, education, all of those things, right? And the government took a decision. And I'd be interested in my Marxist friend commenting on this too. Because the government took a decision to embrace neoliberalism. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to attract more large corporations to invest in South Africa. And effectively what has happened is they have built up a new black middle class. But when you drive on the airport from Cape Town, from Cape Town Airport to the city, you still pass miles and miles and miles of shacks where people live. So some have been empowered, most have not been empowered. And yet, there is an attempt by the government to create this sense of a common South African identity. You know, the World Cup, it was great to be there during the World Cup. It was fascinating. I mean, I should have talked about forget the Super Bowl. I should have talked about the World Cup. I should have brought my vuvuzela. You know. Yeah, I mean this thing called nation building, which is an attempt through ritual, through symbols, national symbols, through constructing a shared story, which is one of the things that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission tried to do, a shared narrative of the past. All of these things constructing a sense of South Africanness, you know. But you can make the argument, and churches became involved in this as well, you know. So churches that identified themselves as being in opposition, right, to the sorts of injustices that were prevalent under apartheid and are still prevalent now, became co-opted into this whole general vision. But ultimately what has happened is it papers over the real splits, the real class divide that is still within the country. Okay, so I suppose what I'm trying to, for my own sort of, this is not really about method, you know, but my own discipline is to look at the ways that functions and the ways that that churches in their liturgies reflect or resist that way of well, whatever it is that allows you to live with this within terrible poverty or with terrible poverty, you know. You have to be taught to think a certain way. You have to be taught to think of yourself as a South African first and a human being second, or a South African first and a black person, or a poor person second. Okay, all of these things are pedagogies, right? So I kind of track the way the pedagogies work, and hopefully I find spaces, you know, in churches or maybe in civil society, as David refers to it, where there is resistance to that general plan of it. And applying that to Canada, I would say that we ought to also be suspicious of Canadian identity. You know, when we assert how great it is to be a Canadian, you know, what are we papering over, you know, as well.
Is there time for one? Well, I'd like to go back to your question about, because I think it's really, really, really important, and it's something I've thought a lot about. So I'll just try to say maybe two quick things here. The first is, I personally.
Which question is this?
Oh, sorry. The question about how can you have a community when you have deep-seated divergences, especially religious or cultural differences in the community, and certainly one solution is to look for some kind of overarching commonality. I think that's a terrible mistake. And the first reason I think it's a terrible mistake is I've never been part of a group of people I liked, even if it was just 2 or 3 people, where we didn't at some point disagree. So if I could use your example of the bus, you know, if you put half a dozen Catholics on a bus and they have to go on a long trip, they're going to find things to disagree about. And some of us here are academics, right? Well, like, we disagree about paper clips, everything. So the fact of disagreement, the fact of differing values to me is not politically the issue. If anything, it's a good thing, because it means there's people we can learn from. It's the kind of disagreement and how it's handled that matters. And at that point, I'm with you absolutely on the, I mean, I think for nation building reasons, we have to have these goofy things like the Sidney Crosby and hockey and stuff. But really, in terms of keeping a community together, like, it's not necessary that there be agreement on anything. What there is, I mean, I think what it requires, and that we generally have, is respect for other people, rooted in respect for the fact that we disagree, and that disagreement can be a good thing.
But how do you have laws?
Compromise. Hear the other side and compromise.
But the problem is, though, is that some worldviews have mutually exclusive perspectives on fundamental issues. What's life? What's not life? When does life end? I mean, all kinds of fundamental things. How women are treated, how many marriage partners you're allowed. So when you begin to talk about profound differences on the very fundamentals of life, where people in a culture are not marinated in the same thing that binds them, how do you compromise? 2 wives, not 4, you know, grade 8 education, but not, I mean, so I agree with compromise, and I agree with respect, but when you're a legislator and you're making laws for the land so that there's unity, right? So on the bus, yes, we can disagree in thought, disagree in ideas, but when it comes to the implementation, right, of when rubber, you know, when they have to put the laws on paper that people actually have to live by, somebody makes a decision. And sadly, I think that who ultimately is making the decision is who has the most power, right? And that isn't necessarily the way it should be. So what I'm asking is how should we be making decisions? And is it possible where you have mutually exclusive divisions in society on such a fundamental thing as our worldview?
That's next year. That's next year.
That's right. That is next year. We are planning a series. Don's been involved in that as well for this coming year, which will explore that in the kind of detail and with the kind of texture that it really requires. It's it is a fundamental matter and a profound matter and a profoundly existential matter because of the deep pluralism with which we live. One of the great gifts of our society, but also a place of enormous struggle. We have to bring this to an end here, so you want the last word?
Sure. Okay. Why is religion being used as an equivalent to culture? That doesn't really make sense to me. I took collectivism and nationalism in school, and we learned that culture is a mix of different things, including religion, but it also includes language, which we all have in common. We also have goals in common. We have some sort of nationalism. I mean, I'm sure most of you guys get up on July and, celebrate Canada Day, or, know the national anthem in general. We have a shared history in Canada. And, we have immigrants and people coming in, but that doesn't mean that they're not willing to share in what makes us Canada. Yeah, culture and religion are not the same thing. And as for differing on fundamental things like, say, abortion or whatever, yes, I completely agree that abortion is a ridiculous idea and shouldn't be happening. But on the other hand, I don't have the right to tell anybody else that they can't do what they want.
There is that was the penultimate one. Let me one final comment and then we'll break.
I don't know if this is a comment. Sometimes I think I don't know anything. But just what was coming to me is a sense of talking about a lot of different ways of being in the world, right here in Canada, around the world, different disciplines. And it just brought me back to thinking about maybe the importance of the discipline again. Maybe, and I heard, I don't know your name, but Reg, I heard you speak of Marxism bringing you to this place of moving into relationship and conversation at a really earnest, humble level. And I heard other people speaking of that, and I just began to wonder about, that place of it bringing you to excellence, this place of, maybe there's all kinds of way of being in the world, but maybe there is something about that discipline, about that practice, regardless of what it is or where in the world it is, that could bring us to a place of living excellently so that when we're on the road to whatever and we see another human, that what we see is another human, and that we respond in that way.
Thanks so much, and thank you so much, Steve. Great to have you. I'll just remind you of the next cafe, which is going to be
March 5th.
March 5th? I can't see anything here. It's March 5th. How much freedom of choice does one need to live excellently? And that is Don Carmichael, who is here and who spoke a little bit today. So that's March 5th, same time, same station. And then our final cafe, we have changed the date for that. Can you give me that, Rebecca?
2nd.
It's moved to April 2nd. Thanks.